Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte's planned talks with Donald Trump comes at a time of mounting strain within the alliance over Iran, defense commitments, and the broader direction of transatlantic relations. With Trump combining sharp criticism of NATO with warm personal praise for Rutte, the encounter could prove pivotal for alliance unity. Joining us today on TVP World to unpack what's at stake is Jens Boysen, Associate Professor at Civitas University, a political historian specializing in European affairs and international relations. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
So can you help us understand how serious is this moment for NATO? And does this visit signal a more deepening crisis or more of a reconciliation within the alliance?
Well, I'd say in any case, it's a serious moment as the mutual critiques between the Trump administration and the European member states of NATO have reached a level that is really, could be called toxic. I usually don't use this word, but it has that effect on the public opinion especially. And severe doubts have risen as to the stability of the alliance. I think it will prevail, but it may have to undergo certain significant changes in terms of its management, its internal communication, and most of all, its strategic outlook, because it seems there are fundamental differences in the perception of the strategic priorities between US on the one hand and the European member states on the other hand, basically due to the simply different objective situation of our two continents, but also due to different agendas. And Mark Rutte has before dealt with this issue last year. He repeatedly was successful in, let's say, finding consensus and agreement between the two partners because he apparently has a certain diplomatic clout and seeks common interest, common understanding between two very different partners who seemingly are being driven apart by global affairs. But I think it's in everybody's interest to maintain this alliance, especially in Europe's interest, because we can clearly say, as much as we may be irritated by US foreign policy on a number of issues, even towards Europe directly, we have no alternative to this alliance.
Right, and you mentioned there are fundamental differences when it comes to the agenda as well, and I think that is what is fundamentally driving the rift between the NATO allies. Now, Trump has praised Rutte personally while attacking NATO as well. Do you think that the Secretary General's close personal relationship with Donald Trump will be able to bridge that gap, or do you think finally the agenda of the two different sides is going to be a little bit too big, too close?
Of course, it's always risky to put our hopes on one person only. That's always, if we're in such a situation, that's always a bit risky and unpredictable. As I said, Mark Rutte has been quite skillful in the past in his attempts to bridge these differences by trying to really highlight the commonality of interests and to take into consideration the specificity of the American perspective and of the European perspective. That was easier during the Cold War, clearly. Things have become much more complicated. The focus on Europe is no longer given, say, the global focus. We're no longer region number one. We maybe number 2 or 3, but not that the focus we used to be, which was, ironically speaking, a certain luxury despite the Cold War situation. So this has changed. And Rutte has, and I think he has been criticized for this by being too friendly to Trump and to not representing Europe enough. But first of all, he has the difficult task representing all NATO member countries, which includes the US, obviously. The other thing is, unfortunately, we need the US more than they need us. That's very obvious. And this is nothing new, but in the past that was kind of embedded in a relatively harmonious and much more unified worldview, and this has changed now. And what Rutte is doing, I think, is, despite everything, the only option, especially the European part of NATO has. We cannot get along without the US. And although all the criticisms have been raised against Mr. Trump recently in Europe are all justified regarding his approach on the Iran war, his communication with the European partners or non-communication, the Greenland issue and all that, this is all correct, but it doesn't help us. We have maneuvered ourselves over the last 35 years into a weak position. And we only have, so to say, the choice between dealing with a difficult partner and being exposed to much more hostile forces in the world. So we have to try to mend this alliance. And of course, that is a very difficult thing. It is an unpleasant situation. We feel unfairly treated, but we are simply the weaker part. I think what Mr. Rutte does, he's been criticized for this to be too friendly to Mr. Trump. Well, what is the alternative to that? We cannot afford a rift. And to get back to your question, if his personality alone will be enough, probably not, unless he manages to win or find new allies, so to speak, inside the alliance on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm positive and optimistic that in the Pentagon and the State Department there are such people who must be explained why Europe cannot move as fast as the US, why Europe cannot be present in so many regions in the world, and especially that NATO has a limited agenda, a limited task to fulfill, and that is defense of our common territory and not intervention in the rest of the world. At the same time, Europeans should try to understand, as much as we're irritated by what Mr. Trump has been doing lately, we must nevertheless strategically support our hegemonic partner. It's not easy, but as I said, we have much more to lose from a breakup of NATO than the US.
Right, and you mentioned earlier that Rutte is likely going to need allies both within the European Union and the Pentagon as well. One of the things that we did notice is how it's actually a pretty extended visit for these type of trips. What kind of discussion, negotiations do you expect might happen behind closed doors? And do you think that perhaps one of the reasons why he's going to be there for a whole 4 days is to seek other partners to negotiate with as well?
Well, I should hope so. And you're absolutely right. The fact that he's going to stay, Mr. Rutte, in Washington for 3 days, that's quite non-standard, let's say. That's a very long stay. And he's probably going to talk to several people, not just Mr. Trump. I'm not totally certain who will be invited, probably Pete Hegseth and of course, Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance, if he's back from Hungary. I don't know that exactly. Including, it should be mentioned, are talks about economic cooperation. That's very important. Rutte was going to try to convince Donald Trump that also from an economic perspective, improvement of the actual transatlantic situation is important and interesting. Of course, it is maybe not the most idealistic approach, but we know that Mr. Trump has been open to economic arguments, mostly economic arguments in the past. It's basically about allowing the Americans to sell even more weapon systems to the European allies. That's nothing new, but that is a field that Mr. Rutte will try to emphasize next to common strategic interests, because in the end, when I say we Europeans need NATO more, because we are weaker and we are more exposed on let's say, continental fronts, hypothetically, of course, the US needs NATO too. For the US, they have not maintained NATO over so many years just to be nice to us, but they do so to have a strategic asset, which is control of the North Atlantic, and to this end, they have to be present in Europe. So I don't see the danger of a full withdrawal of US troops, but even leaving NATO in a technical, formal sense is not going to happen, because for this goal, Mr. Trump would need a 2/3 majority in Congress, which he doesn't have even now, and probably will not have after the midterm elections. But he could, so to say, freeze NATO activities. He could simply start ignoring us altogether and so on, and send fewer troops on. This should be avoided. So I'm not sure what Mr. Rutte is going to tell him directly, but he's trying to convince Donald Trump that still the Europeans, for all their, let's say, difficulties that we're facing right now due to structural problems, due to maybe shortcomings in our strategic planning, we're still the most important ally. And although the US have announced, and it's nothing new, pivot to Asia, all that. So this program is still on. It's just we have to show, and Mr. Rutte, as a representative, so to speak, of the European pillar mostly, has to show Mr. Trump that we're still in it, that we're working on this, that we're improving. What we have to accept, unfortunately, regardless of this meeting, is this style of communication and talking on part of the US administration for some time to come. We cannot change that, but we should work. And as you said, behind closed doors, I'm sure Mr. Rutte will emphasize the hard matter common interest that we still have. He will show the progress made by European armaments industries and improve cooperation. And as I hope, it's not only Mr. Trump who's going to be there. There will be certainly qualified and expert personnel from the important departments. And altogether, I hope Mr. Rutte will be able to build this A-team of, let's say, new transatlantic friends or something like this. What I think about NATO is it might be possible that after all those years, little has been changed in the NATO treaty. And maybe it could be complemented by something what we have in the European Union. We have the Treaty on the European Union and the Treaty on the functioning of the European Union. Maybe we should have a treaty on the functioning of NATO that lines out in more detail what the individual member states should do, or on which fields we have a division of labor, something like this,
right.
To bring this agenda more to the everyday awareness of European and American leaders. That might be a way. This is just my abstract idea.
But that definitely could be a way
trusting Mr. Rutte, he's the only chance we have.
Right, and the stakes are very high indeed. Of course, we have the next few days to observe what is going to happen. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. Good night.
And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.